Senator Cruz, thank you for taking my question. A few hours ago, I was at the town hall with Senator Rubio, and I put to him a question about an idea that's been gaining traction lately, and that idea is an exemption from following the law on religious grounds. And he started out by saying that both religious and non-religious have to follow the same laws. I think that's great.
Senator Rubio did not actually say that, and I apologize to everybody for misrepresenting Rubio's views. If you want to know what he did say, there's a link in the description.
And then he followed up by saying, but nobody should have to violate their conscience. And that's the part I don't understand. How does that play out if following the law violates my conscience? The reason I bring this up is because I'm an atheist, and I'm very concerned that if religion gains access to the corridors of power, that I will become a second-class citizen. And I would like your comments on that, please.
That was a poorly phrased question. Still, there's plenty for Cruz to respond to in there.
Well, sir, thank you for your question. Thank you for raising it. Listen, we are a country that was founded by men and women fleeing religious oppression.
My initial thought to that was, how many signers of the Constitution were fleeing religious oppression? But then I realized that many of the early colonizers were indeed fleeing religious oppression, or at the very least, seeking to live in a way that was congruent with their religious ideas.
And coming, in fact, they came to New England, seeking to form a new land, a New England, where every one of us would have the right to seek out and worship God Almighty with all of our hearts, minds, and souls, free of the government getting in the way.
That's a pretty interesting way of putting it. I suppose the government may not be getting in the way of religion if religion is running the government, because that's what the Puritans set up. And the Puritans may have wanted religious freedom for themselves, but they didn't believe in it for everybody. They persecuted Catholics. They persecuted Quakers. It was the Puritans who hung people for the imaginary crime of witchcraft, and this was all done under the auspices of government.
The very first liberty protected in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights is religious liberty. Now, part of religious liberty is you can choose which faith to follow, and it protects every faith. Whatever faith you might choose to follow, the First Amendment also protects your right to be an atheist. That's part of religious liberty, is every one of us is on our own faith journey. Every one of us is seeking to understand our place in the universe, seeking out God.
Since I've just told him I'm an atheist, he really ought to realize that I'm not on a faith journey, nor am I seeking out God. Now, I would like to think of myself as an honest seeker of truth. So if I stumble across evidence of God on the way, that would be really interesting. But I haven't so far.
And it is our right as human beings to make a determination. Now, your question about religious accommodations, that has been part of American history, American law, American Constitution, from the founding of our republic.
I decided not to fact-check him on that one, because it may very well be true, but it doesn't really get to the core of whether that's a good idea or not. And it also doesn't get to the core of whether or not those accommodations are violations of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment.
There is a reason, for example, that we do not force Jehovah's Witnesses to make pledges.
It's true that Jehovah's Witnesses were key in bringing First Amendment cases to the Supreme Court involving taking the pledge. But the ruling is that no child can be forced to take the pledge. There's no special accommodation for Jehovah's Witnesses. If somebody is aware of some special exemption for Jehovah's Witnesses, please let me know.
There is a reason why Quakers have been exempted from the draft and from fighting in wars.
If somebody is aware of some special exemption for Quakers, please let me know. But as far as I can tell, the reason that they don't serve in the military is because they, like every other religious group, can be conscientious objectors. And here's where it gets interesting. According to the Department of Defense, if you want to be a conscientious objector, your objection has to be religious. That means a religious person can be a conscientious objector, but an atheist cannot be. That leads to the absurd situation that if you object to war for some supernatural reason, you're exempt. But if you make an argument to the Department of Defense that war is bad for humanity or bad for the country, and your reasoning is supported solely on the reasoned use of evidence with nothing supernatural in it, that's not good enough.
There is a reason why Jewish and Muslim truck drivers have been exempted from driving alcohol on their trucks. Because we have long respected religious faith And our law has allowed accommodations.
There is no prohibition in Judaism against driving alcohol around. And the case of the Muslim truck drivers involved two drivers who requested from their employer that they switch a load because they didn't want to drive alcohol, and the request was denied. Now, it turns out that the employer was making similar accommodations for other employees. Truck drivers swap loads out all the time, so the court ruled that the employer had discriminated against the truck drivers, but there was no special law exempting Muslim truck drivers from driving alcohol.
And, if you look at other countries, if anyone chooses to exercise their faith, they risk persecution. I do not believe the federal government should be persecuting individuals for following their faith. For me, religious liberty has been a lifelong passion for decades.
I'm sure that Senator Cruz really is concerned with religious liberty. And at this point, I think I'm justified in engaging in a little speculation that maybe Senator Cruz's idea of religious liberty is too similar to the Puritans' idea of religious liberty. The Puritans really did escape some level of persecution, and when they arrived in the Americas, they set up a religious government which gave their religion a favored status at the expense of other religions. And that's what makes me concerned about being a second-class citizen.
Indeed, we chaired two large religious liberty rallies where we brought forth individuals who told their stories. The media ridicule threats to religious liberty. They say they don't exist. So what we did instead is we brought forward people to tell their stories, ordinary people. And what was amazing is you'd see a florist, a baker, a t-shirt salesman, a soldier, just telling their story of standing for their faith and being persecuted. I'll give you one example. Kelvin Cochran. He's an African-American, grew up in the inner city, very difficult environment. His whole life, he wanted to be a fireman. That was his dream as a little boy. I want to be a fireman. And he ended up achieving that dream. He became a fireman, and he rose up to become the chief of the fire department in the city of Atlanta. Chief Cochran then went to D.C., served in the Obama administration on a National Fire Safety Board, and then he went back to Atlanta to resume his role as chief of the fire department. Now, Chief Cochran was also a Sunday school teacher. And in the course of teaching Sunday school, he began studying the passage in the book of Genesis, where God says to Adam and Eve, "Who told you were naked?" And Chief Cochran began thinking about that and dwelling on it. He began looking for where else, what it meant to be naked. And he looked at where else in the Bible there was a reference to be naked, not just in the obvious sense of not wearing clothing, but being outside of God's covering, God's righteousness, God's grace. And he contrasted that to other places in the Bible where it used the phrase clothed, clothed in righteousness, clothed in forgiveness, clothed in God's grace. And Chief Cochran taught a whole series of Sunday school teachings based on that comparison. He decided to write a book. He wrote a little book. The book is entitled, "Who Told You Were Naked?" In the course of that book, he has a page and a half discussing what the Bible teaches on human sexuality. For writing a book in his private time about what the Bible teaches and what he was teaching in his Sunday school, Chief Cochran was fired from his job. The mayor of Atlanta and the city council said a Bible-believing Christian is unfit to serve in public office. Now, I'm going to say right now, I think that is a disgrace.
Ted Cruz spent an entire weekend at a rally listening to stories of religious persecution. And the story that he thinks best exemplifies the problem is bunk. Had Chief Cochran actually been fired for his religious beliefs, I would be opposed to that. But he was not fired for having written a book on his own time, relaying what the Bible said. And the mayor of Atlanta who fired him, Kasim Reed, himself an observant Christian, did in no way say, even by implication, that a Bible-believing Christian is unfit for office. He said, and I quote, "Cochran's personal religious beliefs are not the issue," end quote. The actions that the city objected to were the fact that Cochran was distributing his book to his subordinates. And according to the city spokesman, quote, "There are a number of passages in the book that directly conflict with the city's non-discrimination policies," end quote. In the private sector, if somebody proselytizes their subordinates or makes public statements that conflict with or violate a non-discrimination and harassment policy, you'd get fired. And rightly so. If a fire chief made public statements that directly conflict with the city's non-discrimination policies, for secular reasons, that chief would be fired. And I see no reason to make an exception because the reasoning behind those statements is religious. So what Ted Cruz calls religious persecution, I call equal treatment. And for the way that Ted Cruz distorted the facts to fit his own agenda, I'm going to say right now, I think that's a disgrace.
And pluralism and diversity means we respect other people's views.
Pluralism means equal treatment in the eyes of the law. It doesn't mean that we have to respect all views. I am a pluralist, and I do not respect Senator Cruz's views on religious accommodations. But I would not persecute anybody who believes in religious accommodations, nor do I believe that political favoritism should be extended to anybody who happens to agree with me on this subject.
If you choose to be an atheist, that is your choice. You have the right to make that. But we also respect the views of believers across this country and the federal government. It's not optional that we protect religious liberty. It is written in the Bill of Rights. And there is a reason why the oath of the President of the United States that is written in the Constitution is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. There is no higher obligation I will have as President than that.
Most of the 13 colonies had official religions. They were paid for by the taxes, and they received favored treatment. You can think of them as state religions, just the colonies weren't independent states. Each official religion was referred to in the terminology of the time as an establishment religion. And that's one of the many things that the Founding Fathers had in mind when they wrote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Now let's recognize the potential for conflict in that phrase. What if the free exercise of religion involves the attempt to make an establishment religion? And that's precisely the problem with religious accommodations. It's showing a favored status either to religion in general or a specific religious group. And once you've granted favored status to one group, it's not such a stretch to call the other group second-class citizens. I propose that the best way to guarantee everybody's religious freedom is the complete and total separation of church and state. No one group should receive favored status, and that way everybody will be equal in the eyes of the law.